for coming. It's such a pleasure. You know, I was born in Philly, school in New York, live in DC. When you come out to the Midwest, you discover that it's actually true that you're nicer than the average person I encounter. And it's funny because my husband's an East Coaster, but all the rest of my family married Midwesterners, and I get the picture. It's also wonderful to come to a place where intellectual things are taken seriously, and interdisciplinary, as I found out with my wonderful conversation with Benedict and morality, and I see is also true here of this institute, because I'm interdisciplinary, undergrad econ, and then grad school law, and then when I was practicing law at a law firm, and I was like, am I going to be doing this for the next 50 years? Is this what I really signed up for? And the financial goals were not enough, and so I went back and I started to, my husband and I were married but living in separate states, so I went to grad school in systematic theology at night, and then went down to Washington, and we finally, after 3 years of marriage, lived in the same apartment. It was very fun. And then I went another, I forget, 4 or 5 years in the doctoral program in systematic theology. So I'm interdisciplinary, even if I'm not expert enough in each of those areas as I'd like to be. So you've heard the topic, and let me sort of tell you how I'm going to try and bring these things together. So I teach family law and law and religion. So, and I'm in a school where 70% of my colleagues have their PhD in econ, in addition to their law degree. Okay, I'm the only one with the theology added. I have a hard-nosed familiarity, therefore, with what family life in the U.S. looks like by the numbers. Its beauty and its struggles to do what families are supposed to do. At the same time, I'm familiar enough with Christian theology, especially the anthropology of the family, which is really admirable. It has high aspirations. It has intellectual integrity, historic pedigree. And if you actually look at people who walk the talk, it has terrific empirical outcomes. But it struggles against the idea that it is anti-women, anti-sex, which is like the worst thing you could say about anything today, apparently, and irrational. Okay, which ought to be okay with everything else that's going on today, but it's not, okay? But it struggles with that. Now today, the family is very permeable. It's not a closed system where you can control the dealings of its members. You can't even regulate the influences on it. Families don't work on farms or in family businesses together anymore, and have an interdependency on each other that makes other things less influential. Husbands and wives are usually in the labor market. Also, news, ideas, opinions, advertising, ideologies, etc., flood individual family members' visual and intellectual space 24/7. Interestingly, we have no national legislative family policy. Isn't that interesting? What's one of the things you figure out in family law? Like, a lot of countries have family policy. And you may or may not like, what Hungary is doing to encourage married people to have 3 kids at least, or Russia has things like, go home and please make a baby because we're dying here. And Denmark has a do it for Denmark strategy. Do it for Denmark. They will pay for a prior vacation if you manage to produce a child for Denmark. We don't even have that, or any family policy, save in just a few areas. We think about the family a little in tax. But we don't think about the family when the nation makes decisions about everything from infrastructure, trade, energy, or even on policies that you would think would be very close to the family, like education, employment, labor, or even really healthcare, even sexual health, okay? There's a little program at the Health and Human Services Agency to deal with strengthening marriages, but it's tiny, and it's not related to all this other stuff, labor, employment, education, etc. It's fair to say, instead, that at the federal level, and really a lot at the state level, I can't go into all the details because there is some variation, but that policy about the family is about individual economic welfare, about consumer welfare, about economic efficiency, but not about the strength and functioning of families. There is, however, at the judicial level, something like a national family policy, and I'll describe it below. This is completely individualistic. The family is the choices of individual people to do family-ish things. Okay? okay? In particular, its outstanding feature is its pro any sexual expression of any body who's an adult, as long as it's consenting. Even individualistic when it's talking about marriage and parenting. One of the most interesting, I mean, think about that. That's like a joint enterprise, right? That's a group thing. We release two, maybe more. And you're even in the Obergefell decision about same-sex marriage. It was all about the right of the individual to have this. So even our judicial family policy is individualistic. All of this non-family focused policy affecting the family, hyphens between all of that, that's what we have, sits alongside one of the other most important things in the lives of American people, which is employment. Okay, we're a free market system, and we also have a system where employment has become a big part of identity. One of the things you study in family law is that the transition of your identity from, are you part of such and such a family, such and such a class, did you marry, then you take on the status of a spouse, etc., to your identity is your know-how, your accomplishments, your degrees, your job, okay, is your identity. So employment is really, really important. And in particular, it was posited at the time of the sexual revolution, which is, you know, really more like the 70s and 80s. I always say the 70s were really the real 60s, you know. Like, people talk about how the 60s were crazy. The 70s, where when you look at the data, you know, divorce, non-marital birth rates, et cetera, the 70s were the real 60s. So about in the 70s, the idea that women should go to work to find their equality, their true freedom, their identity. And the other thing was, listen, work's a safer place. Marriage is violent, men are violent, marriage is patriarchal, it's unequal. Laws, much as they would like to, you can't get in there and force your husband to do 50-50 of everything. 50-50 money, 50-50 housework. Ironically, by the way, if you look at the sort of the empirical sociological studies on this, people who demand 50-50 actually have some of the worst marriages. The best marriages are what's called an attitude of abundance. Is, oh, let's see what you can do and contribute. Let's see what, they may end up 50-50, but 50-50 is not when they start the demand. They actually start with an invitation for giving a gift. It's an interesting stuff, but anyway, don't get me off on that. You're not, I am. Anyway, because of all of this, I was going to say, so they said getting women into the workplace would be the thing that would make us. And of course the irony is that, but men are, but women more loudly and more obviously today are actually struggling with coping with doing justice at work and at home. When work was supposed to be just the crown that was supposed to provide them with all the freedom and equality a girl could want. Because of this, I thought tonight I would speak to you about the inadequate, or sometimes even pernicious, family policy we have at a time when employment practices are what they are, and I'll describe them a little more, and sexual mores as our, really it's the, you know, judicial, and to some extent there's some agency involvement in a national policy that is for the individual, are working together to produce some problematic results. There is no sign that law and policy, all by themselves, are going to change considerably anytime soon to really support the family. So I'll talk a little bit at the end about what we need to think about doing as individuals, communities, and as religious communities. So let me begin by talking about the employment situation affecting so many American families, especially the poor, and the state's inadequate family response. Then talk about one of the leading messages the state sends about families, which I think is actually pernicious in many cases. I will summarize it by saying it's adults at the front door and children at the back door. When families are being formed, it's all about adult private ordering and choices. And when a crisis comes, then you bring in the best interest of the child. You notice the best interest of the child is not at the front door. Okay, that's going to be my thesis about the policy. Then I'm going to talk about what individuals and groups, including religious groups, might think about doing. To begin, briefly, to summarize the employment situation that's affecting so many American families and the state's inadequate response. You've seen the labor statistics, you know, they come into the paper regularly. You have, you know, what they call prime working ages, 25 to 54. You've got about 81% of men in the labor market, 74% of women. Mothers of minors, 71% in the labor market. Okay, now that is split between full-time and part-time, but 71% are in the labor market. There is, however, really not a lot of flexibility given by companies on behalf of the family, okay? It's rare. It's done privately. The most that the government gives is the maximum for companies that fall under the Act, for the Family and Medical Leave Act, 12 weeks unpaid, which for many, many people would be a huge hardship to their families. We are really lagging behind, in my view, the Western countries, the other Western nations that take care of this. And people can make arguments. We're having a great talk at the Markets and Morality dinner about this. People would make arguments that this will have some kind of negative impact on corporate profits, et cetera. In my view, they'd just be giving back what they've owed families all along, right? It's not that we're taking from them, it's that they're holding on to something that they should be giving in order to recognize the strength of the family. So, just a thought. We don't really have a discussion about a living or family wage. We talk about minimum wage, but you notice we don't talk about it in relationship to what families need to be stable, to support not only the couple and their children, but also to save a little for the future, right? In order really to be economically stable. There's also, we talk about this in DC all the time, I don't know if it's a factor here, a discussion about the gap between where poorer people work and where they have to live. And it costs them like a couple of their minimum wage working hour pay a day to get back and forth. Because the cost of housing, especially now that cities are roaring back, is so very high near where the jobs are. Just incredibly high. I don't know if anybody in law school here has studied the Mount Laurel case, where the state, New Jersey actually forbade a particular part of New Jersey from having a zoning law, where poor people had to live so far away from where the jobs were that they simply could not keep body and soul together. And they actually said this violates the state constitution, which requires laws to support people's health, safety, and welfare. You've done a zoning law that only people with money can afford to get to work. It's a fascinating study. So commutes, it's a big discussion in my area, which is a very metropolitan area. For people who need childcare, the Department of Health and Human Services says that, looking at an average American family's budget, it should be 10% of it. And actually 70% of the country is nowhere near that. It's like double or triple. It's 20, it's 30% of what they could afford. We also have the question of people being consigned to part-time or erratic hours. And part of this is done to avoid coming to a level where you have to give benefits. Part of it is done for efficient staffing. I don't know if you remember, there was an article on the cover of the New York Times a year or two ago where a woman, she was a single mother, she was working at Starbucks, and Starbucks literally would give her hours like the night before. And sometimes it was come in at 5, right? And she was trying to pay for childcare. She was trying to earn enough money to live. And Starbucks was shamed on the cover of the New York Times for doing not, just-in-time staffing. They literally have an algorithm that said how many people they thought were going to come in for coffee tomorrow. And if it was X amount, she just would be shaved off of their roster. And they had more people than they needed in order that they would pay all of them no benefits. So there's the question of erratic and unwilled, unwished part-time employment. There's also a huge disconnect between our education and training and the jobs available. One of the things you hear from economists and sociologists who talk about assisting the working poor is remembering that the vast majority of Americans don't go high school, college, job, bing, okay, it works. It doesn't work for most people, and yet we put a disproportionate amount of our resources into it. It works for a lot of people, but it is not the only strategy. And the idea that we don't have more vocational training or apprenticeships is something that comes up in the literature all the time, but we really haven't moved toward it. So this is just some of the issues affecting, and you can see that a lot of these are affecting the working poor and the poor, who I will describe to you also have all other kinds of issues that especially judicial family policy, I think, is exacerbating. So it shouldn't surprise you that not having employment policies that are directed to the good of the community of the family, that we don't really have a federal family policy either, right? And by the way, at the state level, mostly you have family codes, but they're mostly about, crisis moments or initiating or terminating family life. They're not about about sustaining a stable family life. That's not what they do. Our codes are all at the back door. Here's, we don't say marriage is blah, 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 blah. We say, okay, show up with the blood test, or this and this, and you can come in. We don't go on about what marriage is and what it is you're moving into. When you're leaving it, we say, okay, your marriage was blah, 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 and now we can calculate the separation of the property and the monthly support. Our codes are not about sustaining. They are about the moment of formation and the moment of dissolution for the most part. Whether it's adoption, new reproductive technologies, baby making the old-fashioned way, getting married, getting divorced. In some cases, states have provisions for domestic partnership or even cohabitation. We don't have a lot at the state level either, I'll just make that point. At the federal level, and as the states reflect this, I believe too, because it's federal constitutional law and they have no choice, the state's leading message is that it's all about the adult's individual choices, okay? It's all about that at the front door of family formation, which is when children are made, which is at conception. It's all about your choice. We will take care of the children at that point, seeing what their best interest might be at the time of termination of parental relationship because of abuse and neglect, divorce, or other dissolution of the relationship. Then we'll look after the kids and we'll try to do the best we can. The legal framework I'm going to share with you, I dare say you've heard of almost all these cases and they'll be somewhat familiar to you. I'm going to tell it as a story of the formation of this policy. I do think that when lawmakers and judges made these laws, they really believed that they were trying to pursue some goods. In particular, the equality and dignity of women and LGBT persons. I think they thought they were promoting the dignity of persons, okay? And they also thought they were promoting sexual health. Attention to normal sexual health. Good, but I would be arguing that they wildly overshot their goals, misaimed, and were at all times neglectful of children, even though they might have had some noble aims. So looking at the judiciary, I would first point, of course, to the 1972 Supreme Court case of Eisenstadt versus Baird. You may remember that in 1965, in the Griswold case, the Supreme Court held that married people had a constitutional right to contraception. And it said it was because marriage was sacred and private, and the marital bedroom was not a place for the state. Eisenstadt, they come along and say, well, this right, yeah, it's not in the Constitution. We're going to say it's in the Liberty Clause of the 14th Amendment, that the government shall not deprive you of life, liberty, or property without equal protection and due process. The Supreme Court has agreed that they can make up various specifications of what liberty is if 5 of them agree. That's called substantive due process. You think of due process as you have the right to, notice the charges that are against you, to confront witnesses, a hearing. Substantive due process is when the Supreme Court invents rights that are not in the text of the Constitution, on the grounds that 5 of them believe that it's part of liberty. Okay, it's really, I could get more complicated, and you could go to Harvard and learn it too, but that's really what it boils down to. Okay? So in Eisenstadt, they say that the Constitution is a right of privacy that protects single people's decision to access contraception. And they say here, listen, we know we gave the right to married people before, but marriage is not a union. It's 2 individual people with separate hearts and minds making decisions about whether or not to bear or get a child. It's become very individualistic right away. In short, the constitutional right of privacy moved away from the couple and into the heads of individuals, and was framed as a right to make decisions so fundamental as, and then they mentioned one of them was whether to bear or get a child. Okay? Then, of course, Roe versus Wade comes after Eisenstadt. There, the decision was replete with language problematizing children as a huge burden for women. In fact, if you carefully read Roe, and how many times have I read that thing, there is no, one of the ways you're supposed to come up with whether the Constitution has a right is that there's a whole history and tradition of it. And you look back and you say, there's 100, 200 years where states and everybody has assumed we have this right. Well, the states abandoned abortion the whole time. And they say, well, don't look at that test. Pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. Children are a misery for women who don't want them. And therefore, the right of privacy that we have told you is included in the Constitution. It's not in the writing, but 5 of us think it's there. 6, 7. includes a right to abortion, because women would be miserable if we didn't give it to them, because children are such a burden. In Casey versus Planned Parenthood in 1992, it said that sex and decisions about childbearing, it referred to sex as unplanned activity. So unplanned activity and decisions about childbearing structured around the availability of contraception and abortion are constitutional liberties. Why? And here is this famous quote, because liberty is the right to shape your personal identity and your own universe. So in other words, the court's going to say that the Constitution protects anything that shapes your identity and your universe. Of course they made that back up, okay? So later, the polygamists come to court, and they're like, hey, my identity and my universe is totally shaped by polygamy. And they're like, no, okay, bye, go away. We don't want to take that case. Then someone says, my right to die, what could be more about shaping my own personal identity and universe? And they're like, nope, not included, okay, bye. Like, obviously they just made this up to cover the Casey decision. And then they really only ever used it with sexual expression. So then, in 2003, the court states clearly what Casey was implying is that sex completely unlinked to children and to marriage is a constitutional right. They do this by making homosexual sodomy a federal constitutional right. Okay? That's fascinating, given that there's not a history and tradition of that. The court quoted Casey to the effect that people of the same sex having unplanned activity had a constitutional right to do it because it was identity and universe shaping. Okay? Finally, of course, in 2015, the court issues a same-sex marriage opinion in Obergefell. Now, if you think for even a minute about what Obergefell was actually saying, you'll never again just think of it as the same-sex marriage. What Obergefell says about families is the following. No state is permitted to think that procreation is anything special. No state is permitted to think that children knowing and being known by their parents versus a family situation in which the child in every single case will be separated from one or both parents, that there's no distinction between these. That's really the holding of Obergefell. Because the state came and said, well, no, of course, if you look at the history of marriage, and I wrote an amicus brief on this, the Supreme Court in every state's discussion of marriage is, we're happy you're in love, but we're really not here to just bless your romance. What we really want to do is take people whose sexual activity can produce children and really carry it into marriage so you will stay together and take care of them. You're most naturally disposed to them. They need care for a long time. That's what marriage is for. And I'm glad you're romantic too. Go for it. But that's not really our interest. Okay? Obergefell is where the state said, listen, marriage, we're allowed to say that procreation and linking children to the parents who made them is a special state value. The Supreme Court says it's no more valuable than no procreation and having children in every case separated from one or both of their parents. That's what Obergefell says about family policy. I would add only briefly here that it's not only the judicial branch that has acted to facilitate adult sexual expression, completely indifferent to children and marriage. But the executive branch has also actively gone along this path. I don't have time to go through all of it, but for the book that I wrote, I went through the Obama administration's Department of Health and Human Services, their Office of Women and Girls, and I looked at everything that came out of their mouths about sex and family formation. And really what they said, it's kind of a shock. For teenagers, they said things like, if you have a baby when you're a teen, that could be bad for the child. But if you were 20 and over, they partnered with groups like Planned Parenthood and the National Campaign to Prevent Teen and Unplanned Pregnancy, which I just have to say, if you think of it, National Campaign to Prevent Teen and Unplanned Pregnancy, knocked up. So they recently changed their name to Power to Decide instead of NCTUP. I think I said that often enough in articles, they started to get embarrassed. Anyway, so they relied on Knocked Up and Planned Parenthood for information and advice and linked to them constantly on the federal websites to give information to 20-somethings, where they said to 20-somethings things like, if you want to have a baby, it's up to you. If you can pay the rent and it makes you happy, don't let anyone tell you otherwise. This is federal advice. They partnered with the Bedsider campaign of Knocked Up to give you booty logs for the weekend, sex tips to heat up your single life, and postcards with pornographic images on them to send to your significant other on the HHS website. Okay, this and of course we know Planned Parenthood, you know, and their messages, and this were the closest partners to the Federal Health and Human Services. Now, I wouldn't be surprised if many of you said, hey, listen, the government does care about family structure and children's well-being because, and they care about the unitary family, because they provide $2.3 billion of contraception a year, free or at very low cost to young people. So they really want to make sure that, you know, people are not having children when they shouldn't have children. Well, no. Several things. Number one, the entire federal contraception program is out to reduce, quote, unintended pregnancies. And the message has been, if you intend the pregnancy, that's fine. We don't care whether you're married or single. But if you don't intend it, then okay. The other thing is, of course, the programs have been a spectacular failure. In fact, the very groups receiving free or low-cost contraception, so the country as a whole, since the contraceptive programs began in 1970, giving away massive quantities, have gone from a 5% to a 40% out-of-wedlock birth rate, with ever-increasing spending. Among the poor, it's not gone up 800%, it's gone up like 1,200%, sometimes 2,000% rates of out-of-wedlock. It's crazy. So the very audience getting the most has had the very worst effects. Why? Because contraception is not a simple matter of implant or swallow this and everything will be okay. It's not only that it has, you know, an 8% failure rate overall. It's not only that the poor are already thinking maybe they're out to reduce our numbers a bit. It's not only that there are other reasons why people decide to have a child and whether or not they can afford one. You know, there's many reasons why people will decide to have it. We are now in a situation today where, according to Raj Chetty, who's kind of the economic guru of social mobility, he's back at Harvard, Harvard, Stanford, Harvard, one and back, that family structure is the single biggest factor creating the gap between the rich and the poor, which also ends up in the United States creating racial gaps. So we now have, among those without a college education, we have a 54% out-of-wedlock birth rate. Among those without completing high school, it's about 70%. Among African Americans, it's over 70%, and Hispanic Americans have been rising every year. It's about 56% out-of-wedlock birth rate. We know, and I can't go into all the economics here, that contraception, again, is not a straight line to lower abortion rates, which went up every year with more contraception until they plateaued off, or a straight line to just lower unintended pregnancies or lower births among the poor. Unintended pregnancies even a little higher than it was in the 70s now. Why? Well, if you look at some of the economic literature, Janet Yellen, a former Fed chair with her Nobel Prize-winning husband, Catherine McCulloch, an economist who studies this, and I understand she's by here already to visit, other writers on this. Well, you draw people into the sexual marketplace. People who are already sexually active who use contraception, maybe their rates of pregnancy can go down. But because of a phenomenon of risk compensation, if something is insured, people will do more of it. Okay? You get more people jumping out of airplanes and dying once you have parachutes because they think it insures them. Okay? Risk compensation. And a phenomenon known as the prisoner's dilemma, where individual women, if they won't sort of jump into the sexual marketplace, there's other women who will, and they can't get together and make a deal and say, no, as a group, we'd like to preserve, you know, our desire not to enter the sexual market now, and we'd like to stay in the marriage market instead. Anyway, there's a whole variety of reasons why the rates have gone up, but they have, and there really isn't disagreement about that. Furthermore, because for poorer women, there are fewer marriageable men in their neighborhoods, and because they have lower opportunity costs, if they have a baby, they're not missing out, in many cases, on some great job or education. And there are very few marriageable men in the really poorest neighborhoods. As a result of that, the desire to have a child, to be what we are, right, gifted givers, to give the gift of yourself, to have somebody to whom you can give and somebody to love is very, very high. And the most definitive book on this, the study, is the book Promises I Can Keep, Why Poor Women Put Motherhood Before Marriage, or the book about males' experience called Doing the Best I Can. It's just not as simple as here's the contraception. I could add here that because the numbers of premarital sexual partners, the birth of premarital children, and entering into premarital cohabitation are all associated with boosting the fragility of marriage, in other words, the likelihood to divorce, that it's not a surprise that we find more divorce in single-parent households also among the poor. They have less marriage, more abortion, more divorce, more cohabitation, more out-of-wedlock children, more sexually transmitted infections, despite the government programs designed to do just the opposite. With regard to the effects on children, I'm sure you've read this everywhere and somewhere, we know that it has cognitive and emotional effects that are very long, okay? There's also an emerging consensus that sort of the mediator of these effects of the lack of a stable married parents is probably the instability. That would account for why the next most stable household is the single mother who doesn't repartner. But they do repartner, okay? And we also know that when they repartner, that it's the unsafest place for a small child in America, according to criminal statistics. It's the unsafest place for the child to be with the man in the house who's not his father. Why does non-marital birth and family structure play so many effects? Well, think about it. It's not just the loss of money. Some people think if we just put the money in, it would be fine. But I mean, even that tells you something, doesn't it? That the loss of the second partner is always, going to be associated with the loss of that second income. It's also the loss of the spouses supporting one another, the loss of the verbal and emotional interaction between two people and the child, the loss of the social and human capital. A father and a mother bring in, oh, my friend can help you here, my friend can help you there. We have friends and acquaintances. We also know that grandparents don't invest in cohabiting households, even with children. They really will invest in a married household. They're just worried about the instability, let alone in a cohabiting household with repartnering. You just don't. You may get the mother of the mother, maybe, but you will not get really much more investment than that in the studies on these. So there's so many reasons, not just the money, why the children struggle more. Now we know that there's a reciprocal relationship between poverty and single parenting, and then single parenting and poverty. The other thing that we know is that family structure is intergenerational. So among the rich, it's called assortative mating. And what it means is, in a nutshell, men don't marry their secretaries anymore. Okay, just like you get people who go to college and they meet one another, they have had helicopter parents, they've been to museums their whole life, they meet someone in this environment, they marry someone in this environment, their parents were more likely stable, that's why they got through college in the first place, and then they meet someone from that milieu and they perpetuate. And their helicopter parenting becomes intergenerational. Among those who are poor, because of the effects in the neighborhood, the low number of men relative to women who lacking various what women consider qualifications for marriage, a steady job, an absence of a criminal record, an absence of a drug issue, etc. They end up replicating a non-marital situation for their children. A new study is emerging too from the economics of Roz Chetty and another economist named David Autor, that it appears that boys reared without fathers are far more likely than their sisters to underperform educationally and in employment. This Roz Chetty had access to a database of 1 million children, brother-sister pairs of single mothers. He was able to look at the data from pregnancy through to 26 to know that they had similar prenatal experiences, early preschool, home lives, school, etc. The boys fell behind their sister beginning around age 3 and never caught up. And we're beginning to wonder if maybe this is, do mothers relate differently to boys than girls? Do boys suffer from the loss of a male role model? Do girls look at their mother and go, she's doing it all, I can do it all, right? Whatever it is, we know that because 86% of single-parent households are women, that the boys seem to be struggling. And this is not considered, the mechanism is being debated, but it's not considered highly controversial at this point. Now, the federal government has dozens of programs largely devoted to attempting to just fill in all these little deficits, right? So they start with more prenatal care. You're more likely to get support from a partner if you're in a marriage. What you need more help. That's what you need, healthcare. You need someone to talk to, be there for you, because there's actually cortisol effects for a stressed mother, even in the womb, from stress, if she doesn't have that. Then we have the stuff for newborns. We have nurse-family partnership going in the house. Sometimes they're videoing the mother and be playing with her and trying to help her show how to interact with the child and what kind of ways to speak to the child for cognitive development. Then they have early Head Start. Then they have Head Start. Then they have programs to boost school involvement, programs to involve parents in the school. Every Child, Every Day program to get kids to school in the first place. After-school enrichment programs. Summer enrichment programs. Extracurricular funds for extracurricular activities. Summer jobs programs. I could go on, and I do in my book. What we can say at the end of the day is that while the nurse-family partnership and the moving to mobility, moving kids out of neighborhoods where there's not a lot of family stability into neighborhoods where there's more, they seem to show some replicable, reliable results. Otherwise, the general consensus about all these programs is that while we do a pretty good job keeping people in basic food, clothing, and shelter, we really have not actually replicated what a family can do, and we have not provided the social mobility that America is theoretically famous for. In the words of the left-leaning Brookings Institute, right? This is not a conservative think tank. The economist scholar David Rybar succinctly concludes, while interventions that raise incomes, increase parental time, provide alternative services, provide other resources, surely benefit children, these are only partial substitutes for marriage. The advantages of marriage appear to be the sum of many different parts. And in the words of Isabel Sawhill, again, no conservative, she says, for every child you pull out of basic poverty with some social program, you're going to find another falling into poverty because of the breakdown of the family. You're not making any progress, in other words. So, this is the situation that we currently face, and it is becoming, a nation that is self-reinforcing well-being, in large part associated with family structure, being able to replicate it into the next generation, and not doing and replicating problems for families with difficulty who are disproportionately working poor and poor. Any of you who have ever read Charles Murray's Coming Apart, or Kay Heimelitz's book on family structure, and Andrew Cherlin. Again, these are people from the right and the left and the middle. It's a big problem, and a lot of people are writing about it. So, I can give you the ethical arguments, which you already know, about why we have to speak to this. For me, it's the new civil rights issue. Why should people of different ethnic or racial or income categories not have access to the good life of a stable family? Why should children not have that? I think we need to speak about this in civil rights terms, in terms of children's rights and adults' rights, access to stability. It's a huge part of people's stability, happiness, ability to function as employees and as citizens and as members of anything, that their family life is not chaotic. It is also, of course, the fact that children are like the major example of an is that becomes an ought. If you ever read the Hans Jonas, the environmental philosopher, The Imperative of Responsibility, he says the most obvious example of an is that suggests an ought is children. We make them. And I would add, we make their family structure at the moment of conception, which is the one place and time nobody wants to talk about. Because that is the place of adult private order. That's where the adults get all the say as long as it's consensual. It's also the case that what we do for children at the very beginning has outsized effects. Nobel Prize-winning economist James Heckman points out, cognitively, later attainment of skills build on earlier skills. That's why these boys who had fallen behind their sisters, it's like a progression. What you build, it's like building a foundation. If you build it this big, you're going to be able to build a bigger building. If you build it this big, the building's going to be smaller. And they're just not cognitively receiving the benefits early enough so that they have sufficient attainments later. We know that the current attempt, the front door, swallow this of contraception and will just prevent these problematic situations. Failure doesn't even begin to test it. It has decapacitated people for actually forming stable families. Think about it. Someone says to you, hey, we are totally separating out the idea of sex from tomorrow. Make sure you swallow this or implant that. So there is no tomorrow for you two. You don't have any common project. There's no threat of that. There's no kin, there's no family, there's no marriage. There might not even be a text, okay, tomorrow. And then, the moment someone's pregnant, you want them to turn on a dime and be what parents have to be, which is long-term, sacrificial, serving for decades, okay? You decapacitate people. You capacitate them for lack of commitment when you say, remember, sex never has to say tomorrow, okay? I am not putting forward the idea that, you know, everything has to be procreative, that every coming together of a couple has to be procreative. I'm saying that if you forget that it's the place, whether you believe in God or just nature, where God or nature decided to put procreation, nowhere else, God could have done it any way you want. Right? He could have had one sex or the other, he could have manufactured them, he could have grown in the fields. The choosing to put it here, distinction is more revealing than description here, right? The choosing to put it here tells you what here means, right? And so the idea that we've unlinked it conceptually completely is a huge problem. And then we want, somehow, parents, we want the couple to be stable. Oh, do it for the kids. Well, why should I? I'm a self-actualizing identity person creating my identity, and sex is part of that. It has nothing to do with the group. It has nothing to do with tomorrow. We are decapacitated. So it's not only that contraception has failed, it's that it has actually assisted in decapacitating people. The burden of proof is on those today who suggest that we remain in this adults first private ordering regime, instead of turning policies in the direction of the well-being of families. The changes I propose and the assistance, this is my final set of points here, I'll be done in 5-6 minutes, are quite incremental. I have to say first that, I don't know any other way to put it, just stop stupid in foreign policy. I mean, really, just stop stupid. Stop encouraging family formation or recklessly disregarding. These are legal terms, right? I mean, there's intentional, and there's negligent, there is reckless disregard. Stop intentionally telling people that they don't have to be responsible for their sexual behavior. And then stop recklessly disregarding that it's going to, that if you tell people that the adults can choose anything they want consensually, that children are not going to be harmed, okay? So for example, governmental sponsored messages suggesting that non-marital childbearing plans are a good idea or a matter of adult desire is a problem. We now have some new civil rights laws coming in explicitly protecting unmarried couples' rights to live together. I just wrote a law review article on that in the St. John's Law Review. All of that has to go. That's the stupid that we have to stop. Now, I'm not advocating for a return to the sticks of the past. In the past, we had laws banning cohabitation, adultery, fornication, which is non-marital sex, for those of you who don't remember the 50s. And then we punished children who were illegitimate. We punished children for what their parents did, okay? I am not advocating a return to this. They are impossible to enforce fairly. They always go after people of certain races, or, they're not definitely going to be enforced fairly. Also, they're violations of what everybody considers ordinary privacy expectations. We need carrots, not sticks. We need transparency and information. At the same time, I would like to see a full-out public campaign calling adults to their responsibilities, to be responsible at the moment they create their children's family structure. I want ringing and emotional tones like the civil rights message, because I believe it is. Of course, I want to see a continuation of government programs that capacitate people to form families. So you need things that educate, that make sure education is good enough to get a job, that employment is available and fairly paid, and pays enough to take care of a family. I am for all of these: job-sensitive vocational training, apprenticeships, labor market strategies that explicitly, however, link to family formation. Not just because you're maximizing the individual, but you're maximizing what makes individuals strong, which is their community, which usually starts with the family. I also recommend another stop stupid move, that sex ed becomes relationship ed. I don't have time to get into that, but it only makes sense. It's not like sex ed is doing any good anyway. Frankly, None of its forms have made amazing results at this point. I'm just going to say that and take a lot of arrows for that. Regarding contraception, I'm under no illusions that Republicans or Democrats are going to stop the flow of the $2.3 billion anytime soon. And you know, just because we're sort of used to the Obama administration, like sticking the contraception mandate onto the religious entity, don't think the Republicans, they wouldn't have done a mandate, but Republicans are very contraception happy too. You may or may not know that George Bush Sr. was known as Rubber's Bush in the Senate. That was our nickname for him. Because he wanted to contracept poor people basically into smaller numbers, beginning in the third world, but please here too. I mean, you know, there's a lot of social engineering on the minds of both Republicans and Democrats when it comes to contraception. Just don't think that that's just one party. So I know that it's going to go forward, but my proposal there, I would love for it at least to go forward with some degree of informed consent and transparency. You know the labels on the smoking packages, right? You know what Berkeley wants to put on its gas gauges that talk to you about, you know, what carbon dioxide is doing to the environment, you know, a fair warning. My warning on contraception when the government gets involved would say something or some piece of the following. Sex is important. It makes an important connection between the adults involved, but it also makes babies. The moment of conception is the moment the child's family structure is formed. Family structure matters. Parents create their children's family structure. And a stable, healthy marriage is the best place for children. If you get in the habit of distancing yourself emotionally and mentally from your partners and the children you might create, it will be harder for you to form a stable marriage later and to become a dedicated parent. In addition to its health effects on parents, it's possible that widespread reliance on contraception has increased the pressure on women to participate in sex they do not want. I'd love to see something like that. Okay? Finally, what can we do? Well, I think as individuals, as members of the community, we have to make family-sensitive policies, sexual health, direct marriage policies, labor, education, family-sensitive. Many of you will not remember this, but at the end of Evangelium Vitae, that was John Paul II's great legislative call. All policy is family policy. Right? It has to deal with the well-being of the community, not just maximize consumer individually. I love the idea of shaming particular employers. that appeals to me a lot, so there's a lot of us here. Starbucks was publicly shamed into giving advance hours to its employees so that they weren't paying for last-minute, extraordinarily expensive childcare. I would also like us to make changes in our religious communities for parishes, and not to exclude single persons at all, but to the extent that we address families, to have family-friendly policies. I'm just going to say one phrase here. What's with the Sunday soccer games? Stop. I don't understand why any Catholic diocese in the country does not allow families to have Sundays. Just stop. I also think parishes have to become places with attention to family distress. When I went to my own parish, which is no longer my own parish anymore, we had 7 families involved in on the way to divorce, and the pastor thought it was a private matter. And I said, well, the other parents who need to get involved would love to have your assistance if it was private. We also need to be able to communicate about these things to our children. Not only about sex, marriage, and parenting, but what the good life looks like, and where family fits in, where employment and money fits in. Okay? One of the things that drives me crazy about church teaching is that the children are often brought up to think, well, there's the time we feed the homeless over here, and that's the sort of, we're hanging this sign out here, and then there's the no to everything sexual over here, and they're totally unrelated on the great Catholic organization chart in the sky. Okay? I want every child to understand the relationship between feeding a homeless person and the sex, marriage, and parenting teaching that we have. I want them to be able to unify these, to think about integral ecology, to think about intergenerational solidarity, to think about the learning that you take in the family of equality and diversity as side by side, about the equality and diversity between male and female, old and young. In my family, lawyers and artists. I want the family to be able to explain what it is that they're doing at home relates to the great messages of the church. Love for Christ, revealing Christ to the other, as well as the necessity of loving others as we would love ourselves. And I want us to be able to do this in language using contemporary values. I want us to speak about freedom, about equality, about justice, about dignity, and to be able to do this to our children. We have to then distinguish what we have just proposed to them from the world. We have to have the conversation about the difference between the proposal the world is making to them and the proposal that we're making to them. And that our teachings about sex, marriage, and parenting aren't a list of no's just because it's tradition, but because it is these kinds of virtues, natural ecology, generational solidarity, a place where we learn to go out to the other and not be self-focused, the blend between individual attention and communal good, etc. These things cannot be done by osmosis anymore. Catholic family life must be narrated. All Christian family life must be narrated. And you must identify and distinguish what it is they think they're hearing and what it is that we have to offer. There's a new group that just came out, the website came out this week. I'm on the board because it's a passion of mine. It's called Communio. And it's a group that comes in and helps parishes, help families. And they now have years of replicable economic data, random controlled trials, right? It's the gold standard. That this actually has helped keep marriages together and boost the number of people who actually come into a parish, because there's a cycle of relationship between family, marriage stability, and parish participation. One leads to the other, leads to the other, etc. So I think I've said plenty. I'm sure there's more to say, but that's how I bring it together as family policy. And I'll be happy to take your questions. I understand we don't have more mics than this, so if you have a question, which we're happy to take now, just please, I want you to stand up and be, I always say to my students, I can't hear you. We don't have white noise here, but it's a big room, and to stand up and articulate your question clearly. So thank you very much. Yes, sir.
It sounds like you mostly have no hope politically, but it's a community thing.
Here's what I have. I have hope to stop stupid politically. So I would love it, and I think we may have enough members of the Supreme Court to say no, substantive due process doesn't include any sexual expression thing you want to do, no matter what it does to the kids. We probably have 5 for that now. And I have a big old $10 debate with my husband as to whether they dismantle Roe and Obergefell piece by piece or all at once. But it also might happen that the court changes and we don't have 5. So it's really not something you want to place your Christian hope in, right? It's not an eternal hope at all. I also have hope that we will stop selling sexual expression as fulfillment for very young people and for people, again, without regard to kids. I remember, Robert Putnam, who wrote the book on Our Kids. Anyway, he's a big children's advocate, and he did this interview with the Washington Post, and the woman said to him, "So, do you have hope?" And he said, "Well," and he starts strong in the sense, he goes, "Well, it's about kids, I mean, they're just so innocent, and I mean, everybody wants to help kids," and he goes, "Well, maybe." And my husband, who's sort of a hard-nosed Politico in DC, he always says, "Helen, they don't contribute to campaigns and they don't vote. I don't know why you're barking up that tree." But I'm wondering if we get to a point where, frankly, the racial and socioeconomic divisions that we're seeing right now are unworthy of us as a country. And they're painful to see. And the inability to make statements because they're not politically correct about how family is part of it, it's not everything. I'm not saying the government doesn't have a role to play. But I'm saying the family's role it's not only been ignored, but undermined. And we have to get back at least to the baseline. I joke with the people at Health and Human Services as well as USAID. It's like, I think I know like 80% of the appointees, right? So there's a lot of good people, in my view, that are trying to just stop stupid. But can the government do good things? Well, there are some marriage and family programs, like at HHS. One of them the military has done, I don't know if anyone here has done it, called PrEP, Premarital Relationship Enhancement, that has some things to show for itself. We're realizing, I mean, I don't know if you saw the cover of the Wall Street Journal last week. What's the most booming economic state in the nation? Utah. And they linked it directly to the relationship between family stability, family size, local universities, and businesses that are set up to take advantage of what those universities are providing. Apprenticeships, education for good jobs, and stable families so that you just avoid the chaos that has such a high dollar cost, as well as something back and then they have to rework to get to good again. There are some models, and at what point do we cease standing on our ideologies about adult choice? I'm hoping that in the name of good things, harmony between socioeconomic and racial groups, care for the vulnerable, that all of those good values would begin to include my programs, our programs, as well as the ones they currently include. I can never say no because we pendulum swing. I just know politics is very ugly right now, but some good things are getting done locally, and some parishes are amazing. And some family groups, some new classical schools formed by families, some colleges, some institutes like this. When I was at the Vatican once, Pope John Paul II was there, and I did the same kind of advising that I do now. And he said, "It's the time for bottom-up movements. It's not the time for giant initiatives." And that was a while ago now, but I remember thinking, I agree with you. And when reference was made initially to, the vaporized state, I would say, of the credibility of the Catholic hierarchy right now, it's a time for bottom-up initiatives. I made the point when someone asked me when Cardinal McCarrick first went down, who was my archbishop for a while, and CNN asked me to write an article about, what's this going to do to the state of your, the things you teach on and family value stuff that, they've gone down on those exact issues. And I said, well, I don't know, I can't speak for your kids, but mine never really took their lessons from Cardinal McCarrick. Or actually anybody in priests in my parish who were lovely. But they really, when my daughter says, I want to have a family life like X, she names 5 or 6 families that we know, and our husband says, I want to look like that. That's such a happy house. Those people are fun. They know how to have a party, the whole family's there, the kids are there. I never think it actually came from the hierarchy. And it's not to put them down, it's just that's not the main thing that they did. My parish priest in particular is just fabulous. That's not where my kids get their ideas about sex, marriage, and parenting. So I'm hopeful at the level of the community and family. Yes, sir.
First, just thank you so much for coming. We're all very honored to share your wisdom with us, and it was great to talk. With all these issues being so interconnected and interrelated, we talk about incentives, carrots, and sticks. We talk about how we have our identities change from our family to our career, our occupation. How do you see the idea that, and correct me if I'm wrong, but there's a very high correlation between women in higher education having fewer children, women in lower education with less education having more children?
That's actually not true anymore as much.
Okay.
Women with college degrees are now more likely to get married. And are they likely to have more children? They're likely to have about the same amount.
Okay, that's great.
It's changed.
Yes, awesome.
That for the first time, I think this year was the first time they measured, that used to be, what was the expression, what was it called, a blue stocking? That was the old thing that, a woman with too much education was not likely to be able to marry and raise kids either. And now that's actually reversed. And that's, it's very interesting that that's happening.
Do you see certain incentives that are helping to change that, or what do you think is the cause?
Oh, that's a great question. I don't know, you probably know as much as I could. I can theorize about that. One of them is people's natural desire to get married and to have kids. That's just in a lot of people. The idea that it wasn't, you couldn't do it. in the end ends up being a pretty anti-feminist idea. It was supposed to be pro-feminist. Oh, we'll make sure that you don't have the burden of children. Interestingly, one of the studies that came out very recently at the Institute for Family Studies, which is a very reliable blog, said that women on average in the US want 3 children. And that includes very highly educated women too. So I think part of it was just something that was always there. And maybe the idea that, you know, for a while we had to talk about taking the burden of childbirth off her to even speak about women's equality, because she had to meet, there's a scholar named Joan Williams who talks about the ideal male worker. And the woman had to be the ideal male worker. Well, now, we've been working for a while now. Our desire to be married and to have children hasn't gone away. The opportunities to work are there. We don't have to, either politically or anything, say, oh, we have to buy into this, you got to be like the guys, exactly, in order to have a good job or an education. So those are just some of the possibilities. I just think it's been a latent desire all along, and now they don't have to squelch it, although it's expensive. But women with education are going to be the women with stable marriages, are going to be the women with higher paying jobs, are going to be the women who can afford childcare. That's another thing. I don't have all the answers. I don't know if anyone else has any thoughts on that. Any questions? All right. Well, thank you so much, and have a good evening. Thank you for having me.